Well, it's good to see everybody that did show up. Kind of told Doug this might happen, that we might have a very, very small crowd. So let him know that I was right. I do appreciate Brother Eddie's prayer. I appreciate Keith and Gary, the way they waited on the table. Today is not going to be your typical sermon. Now, some of you, at least 2 or 3 people in here, have heard this before. But sometimes I think it's good to repeat so that you can realize and understand why we meet on the first day of every week. So we're going to do a different type of sermon today. It's going to be a medical diagnosis of Jesus' death by crucifixion. I came across this article several years ago, and it really helps me to appreciate and understand just exactly what Jesus went through. So it kind of be just like me reading to you, you listening, and hopefully digesting what comes back out. As ultra-modern people, we're detached from genuinely understanding the words, Jesus died on a cross. First century hearers of this account would clearly understand the horrific implications and be provoked with feelings of distaste, humiliation, and revulsion. My goal is to help bridge the 2,000-year gap by offering a detailed perspective of the physical reality of Jesus' death by crucifixion. The content is an accurate historical and medical examination of Jesus' death, confirmed by today's most credible historians and physicians in this area. We're going to go over some of what happened to Jesus. Jesus endures a panic attack, leads to sweating blood. Jesus' anguish started in the Garden of Gethsemane in the early morning of his arrest. The Bible records that Jesus essentially had a panic attack that night, highlighting the fact that Jesus was in great distress, even to the point of death, while also sweating drops of blood. Jesus was suffering from a medical condition called hematosis. Do you remember the last thing that Jesus mentioned when he was in the garden? Father, your will be done, not mine. Humility. Humility. Medical summary of hematosis states the subject undergoes such intense stress levels, resulting in blood vessels that rupture into the sweat glands, causing a hemorrhage into the ducts of the sweat glands and the subsequent extrusion out onto the skin. Thus, the subject sweats blood. A significant number of cases related to this condition were associated with a severe anxiety reaction triggered by fear. It's essential to understand the exhaustion that ensues with this type of response and to keep in mind that this was before Jesus was dragged around Jerusalem, flogged, and crucified. Do you realize that Jesus feared the crucifixion? But he accepted the position that his Father had put him in, and he did what the Father had requested. Jesus endures a Roman scourging. We don't even know what scourging is. But back then, that's how people were punished. Scourging was the unusual procedure prior to the crucifixion. This type of punishment at the time was the most brutal and inhumane punishment executed by Roman soldiers. The victim was usually tied to a column and then whipped with an instrument called a scourge or whip. The scourge typically had 3 leather straps, and at the end were small balls of metal, iron, or bone that would tenderize the victim's flesh as he or she was beaten. The end of the whip contained hooks that sank into the skin, ripping flesh off the victim. It wasn't unusual to see ribs coming out of the individual. This happened to Jesus, our Savior. The medical summary of a Roman scourging states the severe blows to the chest and ribs resulted in the bones being broken, bruised, and even ripped out during this process, which would in turn cause excruciating pain every time the victim attempted to take a breath. This is called splinting. The victim would writhe and twist in agony, falling to his knees, only to be jerked back on his feet time and time again until he could no longer stand up. The process had no dignity, as insults and scornful words were hurled at the victim for further humiliation. A doctor by the name of Frederick Zubig frames it this way: bouts of vomiting, tremors, seizures, and fainting fits would occur at varying intervals and sometimes appear during the scourging. There would be agonizing shrieks by the victim after each lash, usually begging and pleading for mercy. The scourging propelled Jesus into an early stage of shock. Over the next few hours, there would be a slow accumulation of fluid developing around the lungs and perhaps the spleen. I don't think we can even imagine what pain and suffering Jesus went through. Jesus endures a crown of thorns. After his beating, Jesus was given a purple cloak, a fake staff, and a crown of thorns to inflict further pain and humiliation. The soldiers filed past Jesus, kneeling before him, spitting on him, and taking away his staff. They struck his crown and face with it. Blows from the staff would have irritated the nerves, bringing about pains that would be similar to an electric shock. Exacerbating and remissions of throbbing bolts of pain would have occurred all the way to Calvary. During the crucifixion, activated by the movements of walking, falling, twisting from the pressure of the thorns against the cross, and from the many shoves and blows by the soldiers. At this time, there would be a significant buildup in lungs, pleural effusion, making Jesus progressively weaker, lightheaded, ashen to color, short of breath, and unsteady on his feet. The increased blood loss is cycling him toward hypovolemic shock. Do you remember that Jesus couldn't take his cross all the way to Calvary? That's how bad a state, physically and mentally, Jesus was.